Okay, so we are going to start in 1891, when a German scientist was looking through a microscope at insect cells, and he saw something kind of funny. At the center of the cells, there was this dark stuff. No one had ever seen it before. And he noticed that as the cells would multiply and divide, it would go into some of the new cells, but not the others. He didn't know what it was, so he gave it a really great name. He called it the X element. And he was like, we'll just fill in that X later. And then fast forward 10 years later, and there's an American scientist, and she is looking through her microscope, also at insect cells, and she sees something funny. There's more of this dark stuff, and it's kind of tiny. It's hanging out near the X element. And eventually someone was like, well, if that one thing's called X, like, should we call this other thing Y? And like that, the sex chromosomes had been discovered. So, chromosomes, you probably all know what they are, but I will tell you anyways. They're made up of DNA. Everything has it. It's the blueprint of life. We've got rats, we've got trees, we've got insects, we've got humans. And in the case of human chromosomes, geneticist Melissa Wilson broke it down for me like this.
Typically, you'll get one copy of every chromosome from your genetic mom and one copy of every chromosome from your genetic dad. And we have 22 of these that you get one copy from mom and one copy from dad. And then there's a 23rd pair, X and Y.
So while all the other chromosomes are numbered, 1 through 22, we do not call X and Y 23. I like to think that they were waiting for like a LeBron James to come along. But in this instance, they were like, we're just going to keep the letters, and then we'll give them a title. They called them the sex chromosomes. Now, I would wager that in the United States, these are the most well-known chromosomes for one simple fact, that we say X equals girl and Y equals boy, that they are responsible for sex. And I had to learn this, but when I'm talking about sex here, I'm talking about the way biology gives us gonads, right, which are our ovaries and our testes. I'm not talking about gender, which is how we identify. And so, as a reporter at the show, Radiolab, the audio documentary program I work for, I was like, what's up with these sex chromosomes? You know, like that's kind of my job. I think things are weird, and then I get to call people about them and ask questions, and then hopefully they answer. And in this case, a lot of people answered. And in the 2 years I had of reporting on X and Y as part of Gonads, the series on sex and gender I ended up doing for Radiolab, I found out that these two chromosomes live in a world that is unexpected, a little unsettling, where things that I thought were facts were like twisted in ways I hadn't seen before. And the world goes so far beyond the boundaries of sex, I was like, maybe we should all talk about this. So you all, we're all going to talk about it. And for me, the true story of X and Y starts with their name. So within years of being discovered, these two little chromosomes had acquired more than 10 different names. There was diplosome and heterochromosome and idiochromosome, and most of the names had to do with their structure, their shape, their size. And then there was sex chromosome, which they had been given because of the fact that we had started seeing that the X would go with the females and the Y would often go with the males. But scientists were like, do we really want to call them sex chromosomes? And science historian Sarah Richardson is the one who told me this story.
For 3 decades, scientists were like, you should not call them the sex chromosomes. The X and Y have many functions, and you wouldn't assume that a single chromosome controls a single trait. Imagine calling one chromosome the urogenital chromosome or the liver chromosome.
Scientists, if you dig into the history, it's really cool, you should, were hesitant to commit to such a specific name and such a powerfully connotated name. There was a fear that it would actually be really limiting, maybe to science, maybe to society, but the fear was in the room. And you can see they ended up getting sex chromosome. It's like a pretty juicy title. I mean, it popularized genetics, but in the 100-year history since we settled on that name, you can see it start to get a little complicated. So around 1960, this is going to be our first kind of stop on the complicated world of the sex chromosomes. So around 1960, we had discovered that you could be XYY. They discovered an XYY man. And to digress a little here, it turns out that the model of X equals girl and Y equals boy is really simplistic. You can actually be a whole bunch of different combinations of X and Y, giving you like different types of biological sex. You could be two X's and two Y's together. You could be four X's, you could be five X's, you could be XO. And so I thought that was pretty crazy because I was like, wow, this really upends a model of biological sex. I think most of us in this room have been taught. So a few years after they realized that you can be XYY, researchers go to a prison in Scotland and they do genetic analysis of a bunch of the male prisoners, and they find a number of people who are XYY. And according to Sarah,
they just rushed to publish a theory suggesting that this extra Y chromosome could explain criminality in some men.
yeah. So the logic goes like this. By this point, we're thinking Y is male. We think male is aggressive. So Y must be aggression. If you got an extra Y, you must be crazy. And like, we went nuts with this theory. We called it the super male. They started scanning more prisoners, serial killers, boys. And in all seriousness, there was actually a suggestion that we consider aborting XYY fetuses. So in 1980, this theory pretty much toppled for a number of reasons. One, there had been this really large study that basically showed there was no connection between Y and violence. I think we all saw that coming. And then there was one other thing.
Going back and looking at those original findings in that high security psychiatric institution, they had also found a high number of individuals with an extra X chromosome. So these are XXY as opposed to XYY.
Really?
Yeah. Now, they never claimed that the individuals with an extra X chromosome were super females. They never investigated whether they had higher rates of violence.
Seems like kind of an oversight. I don't know. But I think it's interesting because what you see is if you start looking at these chromosomes through the lens of sex, what naturally falls in place behind is we look at them through the lens of gender and the traits that we associate with gender. So men were violent, and Y explained why they were in prison. The X did not do that because, like, you know, what's X? We don't associate it with violence. And while we don't believe in super males today, God, I hope we don't believe in super males today, there is a very similar conversation that's still happening around inherent violence in boys and biology. So my next stop on the weird world of X and Y, or things feeling a little topsy-turvy, is 1985. The World University Games were set to happen in Japan, and the Spanish hurdler Maria Jose Martinez Patino was scheduled to run. She was like a hotshot, a rising superstar. And the night before her race, they had her DNA scanned. Now, at the time, this was a thing that they were doing because they were like, okay, we don't want men covertly racing as women, so we're going to scan the women and make sure all their X's line up. And so I heard this story from Ruth Padower, who is a New York Times Magazine reporter, and she reported on Maria.
So they tell her the chromosome test results were abnormal, although on the outside, she was fully female. She had XY chromosomes and these internal testes.
And they were like, we hate to break it to you, Maria, but you're actually a dude. You can't race with the ladies.
And so she's thrown off the national team. She's expelled from the athletics residence. She's denied her scholarship. A bunch of her friends dump her. Fellow athletes abandon her. She loses her medals. Her records are revoked.
So it turns out, remember when I told you you can be a bunch of different combinations of X and Y? You can also be XY and be female. You can be XX and male. In Maria's case, she was something called androgen insensitive, which means that she did have some sort of internal testes. They were making testosterone, but her body couldn't use it. And so if you thought of testosterone as like a superpower, she was not benefiting from it. And so eventually sports authorities let her back in, but her career was done. And in this instance, you see how if you assign sex to a specific place in the body, or at least this is what I saw, right? If you assign sex to a specific place in the body, it somehow makes us think that we can go into a body, look at a specific place, and tell someone we know something more about them than they know about themselves. And that feels terrifying to me. And we don't genetically test female athletes anymore, but you can see very similar conversations happening when we talk about testosterone in sports. You can also see it in suggestions that we take transgender individuals and we genetically analyze them and we tell them who they are. That is real. That is a conversation that has happened recently. The last place that I'll share with you where these chromosomes got complicated for me is this one thing that Melissa told me.
You can't survive without an X chromosome. No matter your gonads, no matter your identity, every single human being has to have an X chromosome because without one, the rest of your body doesn't develop.
Why do we call this the female chromosome? Okay, this is something I'd never thought about, but literally every single person in this audience has an X chromosome. I am not lying. Every single person on the planet has an X chromosome, but no one's going around going like, oh, this is the every person chromosome. You know, from somehow it's over here, the Y's over there, and they must be really different. And I'm just like, oh, it'd be so much better if it was the every person chromosome. And not just because I'm love you all and I want you all in, but because of what we're overlooking by the fact that we consider it female. Because I'm going to tell you one of the craziest things I found out, which is when you think about the X chromosome, of the almost 1,100 genes on the X chromosome, how many do you think have to do with sex and reproduction? Just get a number in your head. 4%. That means 96% of the rest of that chromosome is doing something that has nothing to do with your gonads. And I guess as all of these some of them social stories, some of them scientific stories, some of these facts started to add up, I just thought, why are we calling these the sex chromosomes? Or if we are, maybe we all like that name, should we just allow ourselves to think about them a little more broadly? Because if we do, what insights would we gain as people, as scientists? And we're at this point where we're thinking about, how do we want to teach science? What do we want to fund? Who do we want to be as a society, you know? And I just wondered if it wasn't a moment to rethink the biology of X and Y, and at the very least, to remember, the footnotes of history, which is that the dude who came up with the phrase sex chromosome actually was hey, everyone, just remember, this is just, and I quote, a form of shorthand. We should not take it literally. Thank you.
In 2017, I decided to go on a national conservative talk show. I always love a challenge, and I didn't want to shy away from this one. I had just spent the previous year teaching people in the rural South how to talk about things like abortion, working at Planned Parenthood, and I spent the previous year working at Heineken in government relations. So I love a good challenge. And so when it came time for me to talk about safe spaces, I decided to do it on a conservative talk show. Bad messaging, I know, but I think I did a good job. Anyway, so safe spaces in the context that in the United States we have several different programs aimed at targeting, harassing, and surveilling different communities. Against the Muslim community, it's called Countering Violent Extremism. It's supposed to be part of this counterterrorism effort, but what it ends up leading to is further radicalization, further marginalization, and mental health issues throughout these communities who are affected. So I made the argument that what if we spend the taxpayer money that goes into those programs that are harmful and we put those into community spaces where people can talk about the difficult things, come closer to their communities, and feel empowered that they don't have to feel alone. And so I made that case, and I said, and in fact, let's not stop there. Black people need safe spaces where they can be free from police violence and from racism. LGBTQ people need spaces where they can be free from hate violence. The Pulse shooting had just happened a year prior to me going on the show. And the host, who very rudely interrupted me, said, "You're not there to speak on behalf on those communities." And I said, "Well, Tucker Carlson, in addition to being a Muslim woman, I am a Black queer person." And thank you. And I had just come out on national television to most of my family, to people all across the world, and to all of my coworkers. And I couldn't put it back in the box. It was the Pandora's box. Everything was out. I could feel my phone notifications buzzing. People were sending me death threats. People were sending me words of encouragement. GLAAD had reached out. Amazing things. But I just wanted to get through the interview. And I think I did a good job. You can check it out on YouTube. Highly recommend. But now I'm kind of the token queer Muslim, and that's not the case at all. There are so many of us. There's Leo Kalian, there's Abdi Lak, there's Fazia Misra. There's so many of us. And today I work with an organization called Muslims for Progressive Values, and we work to advance progressive values of Islam, values that are very much rooted in historical context. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start at the beginning. I was born Blair Elizabeth Brown. Yes, not Blair Amani, I changed my name. I converted to Islam in 2015, but I had grown up in a Christian community, but not a conservative one. I'm blessed to say that I never grew up in a space where people were telling me homophobic things, whether that was at home, at school, or at church. I grew up in a family where literally the first time I've ever heard anything in the gray area of homophobic was last week, and it was a mistake. It was a misunderstanding, thank goodness. And so I kind of grew up feeling like I could be whoever I wanted to be, including my sexual orientation and my gender identity. And so when I had my first bisexual crush when I was 8 years old, I didn't completely know what it meant, but I knew there was something there. You see, I had a crush on this kid, whose name I won't say because that's very awkward, and his sister. And I liked them for distinct reasons. It's kind of that age where you start getting butterflies in your stomach because somebody writes you a Valentine's Day card, even though they wrote it for the whole class. But you feel a little bit special. And right as that was happening, I started to become concerned because when I saw things like Disney movies, there was always a prince and a princess, or a beast and a princess, which is also confusing. But I knew that there were no princesses or princes together, and so I felt like maybe I should suppress this part of myself, and I did, kind of. That is until I came out to my mom when I was 15. You see, I was standing there in front of her, very ABC Family style, in my all-girls Catholic uniform, and I said, "Mommy, I'm a lesbian." And she goes, "Oh, no. Honey, you're bisexual." And I am. And I was before, and I will be forever. But I finally had something to call it. And when I converted to Islam in 2015, I felt very comfortable and very aware of the fact that Allah made me with all of my flaws and perfections, but made me to be a queer Muslim because Allah makes no mistakes. And so when I converted, I started to get messages from people, especially after I came out, people asking me, how do I reconcile being a person of faith and being queer? And I always say, we don't reconcile identities in my house, we reconcile bank accounts, okay? There's nothing to reconcile, because in the Quran, there is no condemnation of same-gender loving relationships. And I know, maybe some of you in the audience here, some of you online, all the people online, are saying, but Blair, what about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah? What about the story of Prophet Lot? And so, for you non-religious people, oh, to be one of you. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is a story about a town that was doing horrible acts of rape, acts of incest, acts that we know in human psychology cause trauma and pain. Not a condemnation of same-gender loving relationships, things that do not cause trauma and pain. What does cause trauma and pain, and even mental illness, is having to hide parts of yourself because people use religious texts against you. And so, first and foremost, I'm a historian. I'm also a Black woman. And in my culture, we believe in receipts, and that is when you demonstrate facts based on what you're presenting presently. So here's some receipts, okay? First and foremost, when Muslims and Christians began to come into contact with each other, Muslims were known for being very sexually permissive, not sexually restrictive. So seeing this narrative today that Muslims are uniquely homophobic is not at all rooted in history. In fact, Muslims were often characterized as perverted or bisexual. I'm the latter. And so, as this continued, the time when we started to see more of a puritanical approach to Islam was when there was contact with European Victorian morality. Moralities that started to criminalize things like same-gender loving relationships and starting to define things like sodomy, acts between people who both have penises, as bad and villainous and something to be condemned, and something to be codified in the law as being condemned. At that time, in the 19th century, you start seeing legislation being passed in places like Lebanon and in places all across the Islamic world that condemn these acts. But it did not come from Islam. And so, of the 5 Islamic countries that do not have anti-sodomy legislation on the books, those are countries that do not have the same relationship with colonization as countries like Saudi Arabia and Brunei. Those are the facts. The other thing too, though, people like me, people who are Muslim and who have progressive values, are constantly being charged with westernizing the Muslim world. But the Muslim world is already westernized. These ideas of puritanical values, of interpreting the Quran to be oppressive, those did not come from Islam. Those came from colonizers, Western colonizers. And so, how do we make a world where people don't take their lives because they feel like they cannot reconcile being queer and being Muslim, or being queer and being a person of faith? Well, first, it comes by knowing that queer people are born within every demographic in the world. There are queer Jews, queer Mormons, queer Catholics, queer Protestants, queer Muslims, and I'm proof. And I will continue working toward a world where we can be our full selves. Because like the rainbow that represents us, LGBTQ people are beautiful and naturally occurring. Thank you so much.